Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's Artful Conversation. I am Erin Monroe, the Kriebel Curator of American Art and the liaison for our Jewish Art and Culture Research Initiative, which inspired today's talk. This is the second in an ongoing series of talks, and the first one was presented by our speaker, Rachel Gerstein, back in November on a contemporary painting by Deborah Cass titled Single Red Yentl, and is available on the museum's YouTube page, and I will place a link in the chat. A little bit of context for this project. It is part of a broader effort across the museum to offer deeper perspectives and insights on underrepresented artists and artworks in our collection. Just as the museum cares for its collections in the physical sense, so too are we bringing new attention and varied perspectives. And the stories we tell and conversations we have are generated by our collection in new and exciting ways. I will let today's speaker share more specifically about the origins of this project and its goals. Today, we have opened up this this program beyond our museum membership. And this was a very eye-opening experience for the November talk, where the response was quite strong. But this is typically a perk of membership to the museum. And with that in mind, for any of you that are new to the Wadsworth Atheneum, welcome and thank you for tuning in. We have an incredible collection of nearly 50,000 objects from antiquity to contemporary art. And recently we had the great honor of being named one of the top 25 museums in the country by the Washington Post. Before I introduce Rachel Gerstein, I do want to expressly thank the funders who have supported this important initiative. They include the Zachs Family Foundation, the Cheryl Chase and Stuart Bear Foundation, the Goldfarb Family Fund, and an anonymous funder. Now for today's speaker. Rachel Gerstein melds an art history training and Jewish background to help present an expansive view of art and visual culture through the lens of the Jewish experience. Based in New York, Rachel is an independent scholar who's worked both in the nonprofit and private sectors of the art world, including the Yale Center for British Art, the Hillstead Museum, and New York's Richard Feigen Gallery. She trained at the Courtauld Institute of Art in London and obtained an MBA with a concentration in nonprofit management from Columbia Business School. For nearly 2 years, Rachel and I have been mining the museum's collections to learn more about the objects that would benefit from her voice, our voice, and additional context. So I am very excited to have the talk today provide a little bit of insight into what we've been working on and specifically what Rachel's been working on. At the end of the talk, I will host a Q&A. So thank you for tuning in and please welcome Rachel Gerstein.
Thank you, Erin, and hello, everyone. As Erin said, this is the second artful conversation I've had the privilege of presenting for the Wadsworth. The project has great personal meaning at the intersection of art history and Judaism. And to begin, I'd like to review the mission of and context for the Jewish Art and Culture Research Project. The project examines the Wadsworth's collections through the lens of the Jewish experience. It aims to illuminate the complexity and vibrancy of the Jewish people and to offer a broader and deeper understanding of Jewish history and culture. Launched in November 2023, the project considers the topic expansively and across time, moving beyond a traditional emphasis in art museums on Judaica, defined as ceremonial art used by Jews for religious purposes. This approach also reflects the Wadsworth's range of objects relevant to the topic. Across the country, few, if any, comparable American art museums have undertaken initiatives such as ours, making this project an inspiring example in the field. But first, a word about the project's ironic timing. It was in October 2022 that Matthew Hargraves, the museum's director, Erin Monroe, its curator of American art, and I began our discussion about considering the museum's permanent collections through a Jewish perspective. And nearly a year later, when the project was merely a germ of an idea, funding for it materialized just a few weeks before October 7th, 2023, and the surge in anti-Semitism in this country and across the world. Sorry about that. The impetus for this project occurred in September 2022, when an Instagram post by Matthew, a colleague of mine from many years before at the Yale Center for British Art, featured Camille Pissarro's striking painting of his eldest daughter, Minette. I had recently seen the painting, owned by the Wadsworth, but on loan to the Jewish Museum in New York City, where it was included in an exhibition called Afterlives, Recovering the Lost Stories of Looted Art. Minette, made in 1872, has an unbelievable history, just one of the many multi-layered stories of formerly Jewish-owned objects that survived World War II and have gone on to have afterlives in museums and private collections. "You must be versed in the Holocaust story behind this work," I texted Matthew on September 22nd, 2022. "No," he immediately wrote back. "And unbelievably," he said, "I was utterly unaware that Pissarro was Jewish and of the anti-Semitism he experienced. Please tell me more. These are stories we need to be telling. The current label says nothing about this." Indeed, the text of the Wadsworth's label for Minette, which Matthew shared with me, read as follows. Pissarro painted several portraits of his daughter, Jeanne Rachel, nicknamed Minette. In this sympathetic portrayal, rendered with a striking realism, Pissarro shows her standing in the middle of a room, hands clasped and looking out at the viewer. The simple, natural pose and innocent gaze of the little girl capture her shy personality. Muted colors and soft illumination evoke the peace of her domestic environment. Tragically, Minette died in 1874 at the age of 9. And featured here on the screen is the text of Minette's label at the Afterlives exhibition at the Jewish Museum, which read, "The painter's beloved young daughter, Minette, looks out at the viewer, hands gently folded. This intimate portrait has a complex and tragic history. Pissarro gave it to a friend with whom he and his family stayed during the birth of another daughter who died in infancy, as a token of gratitude and grief. A mere 2 years after the painting's completion, Minette also died at the age of 9. After her death, the painting was returned to Pissarro, for whom it served as a symbol of mourning for a second time. By the outbreak of World War II, this painting was in the collection of Bruno Stahl, whose father was president of the Jewish community of Berlin, assisting Jews who were attempting to leave the city during the Nazi regime. Stahl stored his paintings in a Jewish bank vault before leaving Germany for the United States. After the fall of France, the vault was looted and the painting was sent to the Jeu de Paume. Like Paul Cézanne's Bather and Rocks and Pablo Picasso's group of characters, also on view in this exhibition, the work was loaded onto a train in 1944, bound for a Nazi warehouse. The train was found by 3 French soldiers who took possession of the artworks on board. After the painting was recovered by Allied authorities, it was returned to Stahl. Of note, neither label, not even the one in the Jewish Museum exhibition, mentions the fact that Pissarro was Jewish. So not only is a crucial aspect of the life of this painting that it was held in Nazi hands, not captured in the Wadsworth label, but also the Jewish identity of its maker, complicated as it was, is not explained at all. These are the very sorts of stories Matthew, Aaron, and I hoped I could research, bring out into the open, and share with the public via this project. The painting on the left will be quite familiar to those of you who were able to attend the Wadsworth Artful Conversation in November, which introduced the Jewish Art and Culture Research Project. As a bridge connecting the last artful conversation with the one today, let's take a moment to rely on a classic art historical technique and juxtapose the painting on the left, living artist Deborah Cass's single red Yentl made in 1992, with Pissarro's Minette on the right. With a little bit of poetic license, two Jewish females standing in frontal positions gaze directly out at the viewer. And the color red weaves the two paintings together, as the circles I've added to Minette highlighting her red dress and socks are intended to show. The Wadsworth owns two paintings by Pissarro. In addition to Minette, now on the left, also in the collection is one of the customary landscapes for which he is better known, Landscape with Flooded Field of 1873 on the right. I'm going to focus on the Minette painting though, because as noted earlier, Minette's history of ownership launched our project in the first place and also lends itself to a discussion of Pissarro's complicated Jewish identity. The Wadsworth painting depicts Pissarro's second child and first surviving daughter, Jeanne Rachel, at age 7. Born in 1865, she was named for her two grandmothers and nicknamed Minette as a baby, which means kitten. Of all the Pissarro children, there were 8 in total. Minette was said to have been her father's favorite. He painted her more often than any of his other children. Generally, Pissarro painted landscapes and figural compositions, but only a few portraits. His portraits almost exclusively depicted members of his own family, and occasionally close friends or peasants he knew well. His family portrayals were often unsigned or dated, just a seamless documentation of everyday life in the Pissarro household. Of all the major Impressionists, Pissarro was the only one for whom his children were central throughout his career. This was in stark contrast to the others who avoided representing their own family life, even if children in general did figure prominently in their iconography. As another point of reference, 1874, the year Minette died, was also the very same year of the first Impressionist exhibition in Paris. On this slide, and on the next two, I spotlight other portraits of Minette which help contextualize the Wadsworths. The 3 images on this slide, also painted in 1872, present Minette against a much less particular, more diffuse background than in the Wadsworth's painting. Whereas in the 1860s, Pissarro typically portrayed his close family in everyday domestic scenes, frequently his wife nursing a baby, set against simple backgrounds, by the 1870s, more detailed settings became especially important components of his portraits and still lifes. This compositional shift is apparent on this slide, in which you can see a very distinctive background in each image. In the painting in the middle, now in the Emile Burl collection in Zurich, we see Minette in the lower left as a young toddler clutching her mother's skirts against a landscape background. The garden in the next image on the right also depicts Minette in a specific location. And the Wadsworth painting on the far left falls very clearly within this shift toward a figure against a specific background. In our case, Minette is portrayed in a unique domestic space with a patterned wallpapered corner on the upper left and a mirror and table on the right. As you heard earlier, Minette tragically died in 1874 at the age of 9 from a respiratory illness, 2 years after the Wadsworth painting was made. By October 1873, she was already quite ill, and Pissarro represented her decline, as in these 2 moving paintings on the left and in the middle, of Minette with very short hair, almost sealed inside, removed from the world. The lithograph of a child on her deathbed on the right is also speculated to have been Minette. Pissarro's handling of the short life and death of his own child was remarkable and unique. Our painting is notable not only for its empathic depiction of Minette, but also for its structural elements. It has a more interesting composition than the other single portraits due to the positioning of the diminutive figure standing, not sitting, in a room, accompanied by the still life on the table in the background. The many vertical lines emphasize the figure who confronts us with the frontality of her pose, accentuated by the curve of the table, echoing her clasped hands. The painting is really 3 things at once: a portrait, an interior genre scene, and a still life. For reference, I have included here on the right an iconic example of a still life painting by Pissarro. Finally, look at how Minette's 2 legs fill in the missing legs of the table behind her. 4 of the table's 6 legs are visible, and in a witty pictorial touch, Minette's legs provide the missing 2. I personally also find it interesting to note the inclusion of a shimmering silver tea or coffee pot in the still life encircled in red, which Pissarro painted into the Wadsworth composition. To date, it is silver Judaica, ceremonial Jewish ritual objects, that have been the primary point of entry for most American art museums wishing to engage with Jewish art. Anecdotally, when I mentioned the Wadsworth Jewish Art and Culture Research Project and Minette to friends and colleagues, I cannot tell you the number of times someone has told me that this fact, Pissarro being Jewish, came as a complete surprise to them. The Wadsworth's very own director is a case in point. The abbreviated biography I'll now give sets the stage for my discussion of Pissarro's complicated Jewish identity and its impact on his life and art. Pissarro always lived in the diaspora, outside Israel, the Jews' ancestral homeland. While today we think of him as French, he was born in 1830 on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas, then a Danish colony. His parents were Sephardic Jews, and his father immigrated to St. Thomas from Portugal, seeking a community where he could practice his religion freely. Pissarro's parents were religiously observant and belonged to the synagogue in St. Thomas's capital, Charlotte Amalie, which is one of the oldest synagogues in the Western Hemisphere. Though they had a strong connection to their Jewish community, they had weak national ties. At the age of 11, Pissarro was sent to study in France, where he fell in love with French culture. After several intervening years back in St. Thomas and then in Venezuela, he returned to France at 25, living mostly northwest of Paris, and then in Paris itself at the very end of his life, where he died in 1903. By the time Pissarro's career had taken off, he seemed fully embedded in French life and had become staunchly secular. He had fallen in love with and married a Catholic French woman, which displeased his parents, and he renounced Judaism in his own nuclear family. Of note, it is speculated that the choice of the name Jeanne Rachel for his eldest daughter, the Old Testament name Rachel after her Jewish grandmother, might have been an attempt at reconciliation and appeasement. When contemporaries compared Pissarro's paintings to those of Jean-François Millet, the painter par excellence of French peasants in rural landscapes, whose works had a strong religious Christian influence, Pissarro firmly denied this comparison. He wrote in 1882, "They all hound me, but Millet was biblical, while I, Hebrew though I am, seem to be very little so." While Pissarro acknowledged here that he was Jewish, he minimized his background. He explained that his own choice of composition had nothing to do with biblical Hebrew subjects. For a long time, scholars dismissed or excluded Pissarro's Jewish identity. I think this is not only because he himself downplayed it, but also because his customary landscape paintings, like Landscape with Flooded Field of 1873 at the Wadsworth, did not seem remarkably different in content from paintings by his Impressionist contemporaries. I believe, too, though it is impossible to know for certain, that this oversight may also have been attributable to anti-Semitism in our culture at large. When Minette entered the Wadsworth collection in 1958, press releases and museum articles made not a single mention of Pissarro being Jewish. This wasn't unusual. One of the most revealing quotes I found in the literature, written in 1967, noted, "Through his ancestors, Camille's father, Frederic Abraham Gabriel Pissarro, belonged to the Portuguese Jewish community. He was French, though." In essence, while this scholar acknowledged that Pissarro was born into the Jewish faith, he emphasized that his national identity entirely eclipsed this fact. It was as if the two, being Jewish and being French, were mutually exclusive. About 15 years ago, art historian Rick Britell was one of the first scholars to forge a new path in the Pissarro literature regarding the importance of the painter's Jewishness to his life and art. In 2011, Britell presented an exhibition and accompanying catalog called Pissarro's People at the Fine Arts Museum of San Francisco and the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts. He argued here that while many serious studies of Pissarro before his had begun to acknowledge Pissarro's religious background, few treated it as important to his career as a painter. And when scholars prior to Britell did acknowledge Pissarro's Jewishness, they typically assumed he outgrew and discarded his Jewish childhood, making it irrelevant to his art. In such cases, no convincing links to his artistic production were made, and it was concluded that Pissarro's Jewish heritage was notable, but not essential. Britell took issue with this interpretation and concluded quite differently that nothing could be further from the truth. He explained that dropping one's religious practice, as Pissarro did, was common for many Jews in the 19th century. But a thorough study of his correspondence, both sent and received, shows that he assiduously maintained contact with numerous Jewish relatives throughout the world, and that it would still have been an intrinsic part of his identity. Belonging to a Sephardic Jewish family living in the diaspora was vital to Pissarro's life and art. He experienced France always as a Jew, albeit a secular one, and as a foreigner. He never felt fully at home there. This idea of Pissarro not feeling fully at home anywhere, of being an outsider, is foundational to my presentation. Funnily enough, also in 2011, the very same year as Britell's exhibition, Samantha Baskin and Larry Silver, two art historians on the forefront of calling for more explorations of Jewish art, posited the need for a serious consideration of how being Jewish might have affected Pissarro. It was almost as if Brittell had heard their call. Baskin and Silver wrote, "Even though some Jewish artists are well known, their Jewish dimension remains understudied. For example, a leading Impressionist painter, Camille Pissarro, from a Sephardic family in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, attempted to shed his Jewish ethnicity while in Paris. Nevertheless, he was still identified by his peers as Jewish in the same era that culminated with anti-Semitic cultural strife around the Dreyfus Affair." These scholars remind us that no interpretation of Pissarro's Jewish identity is possible without considering the Dreyfus Affair and the political climate in France at the very end of his life. To our modern eye and news cycle, it's hard to imagine a political crisis that extended for over 10 years. Alfred Dreyfus, pictured in the photograph on the left, was a Jewish captain in the French army. In 1894, he was falsely convicted of passing military secrets to the Germans after a French spy at the German embassy in Paris discovered a ripped up letter in a trash can with handwriting that was said to resemble Dreyfus's. Dreyfus was soon court-martialed, found guilty of treason, and sentenced to life imprisonment on Devil's Island off French Guiana. The political caricature on the right portrays Dreyfus as a traitor, and the print in the center illustrates how, following his conviction and prior to his exile, he was forced to participate in a public ceremony in Paris where the military insignia was torn from his uniform and his sword broken. He was paraded before a crowd chanting, "Death to Judas, death to the Jew." In 1896, the new head of the Army's intelligence unit, Georges Picquart, uncovered evidence pointing to another French military officer, Major Ferdinand Esterhazy, as the real traitor. However, when Picquart shared his discovery with his bosses, he was discouraged from continuing his investigation, transferred to North Africa, and later imprisoned. Nevertheless, word about Esterhazy's possible guilt began to circulate. He was court-martialed in 1898, but quickly found not guilty. After Esterhazy's acquittal, a French newspaper published an open letter titled "J'accuse," I accuse, by the well-known author Émile Zola, in which he defended Dreyfus and accused the military of a major cover-up. Zola was subsequently convicted of libel. In 1899, Dreyfus was court-martialed for a second time and found guilty again. Although he was pardoned days later by the French president, it wasn't until 1906 that Dreyfus was officially exonerated and reinstated in the army. Of note, it was in 1893, just before the Dreyfus affair began to unfold, that Pissarro painted his first views of Paris. By 1899, the year Dreyfus was finally pardoned, Pissarro was living on the Rue de Rivoli, from which he could see from above and paint Les Tuileries and Le Carrousel, Two such paintings are pictured here. But alas, Pissarro died in Paris in 1903, not living to see Dreyfus's exoneration. The Dreyfus affair deeply polarized France. At first, the Jewish Pissarro did not take a stand to supporting Dreyfus, probably because he once again wished to distance himself from this aspect of his identity. But when systematic anti-Semitism felt inevitable, and when Émile Zola's letter J'accuse made front-page news on January 13, 1898, defending Dreyfus and accusing the French government of anti-Semitism, Pissarro's earlier ambivalence dissipated. Indeed, in a letter of January 19, 1898, Pissarro discussed how at 5 o'clock one afternoon, he was walking to see his dealer, de Ronruel, when he found himself in the middle of a gang of youths shouting, "Death to the Jews! Down with Zola!" The white-bearded, hook-nosed Pissarro felt in his bones that he stood out as a Jew in a city brimming with anti-Semitic demonstrations. Despite all these anxieties, he wrote, all he could do was work at my window as if nothing had happened. And not only did the Dreyfus affair fiercely divide public opinion, but it also divided the community of Impressionist artists. While Cézanne, Renoir, and Degas supported the French government and were anti-Dreyfus, Monet aligned himself with those supporting Dreyfus. Initially, Pissarro managed to maintain his friendship with Degas, even amidst Degas' virulent anti-Semitism. Pissarro seems to have looked the other way and persisted in writing affectionately about his friend. Ultimately, though, as the Dreyfus affair dragged on, along the way, he lost the friendship of Degas and Renoir. It seems Pissarro would have been reminded that however little a Jew he perceived he might be, a Jew he nonetheless remained. In the gallery at the Wadsworth where Minette hangs, there is a Degas double portrait just to its right, pictured here on the right too. We have not yet had the opportunity to bring to light for the public Degas and Pissarro's challenging friendship, but this is yet another path worthy of exploration and amended labeling. I believe the two opposing stereotypes must have beleaguered Pissarro during his entire adult life. We can see him wrestling with them early in his career. On the one hand, he lived with the negative stereotype of the deceptive Jew who is greedy and miserly. In his drawing Capital from Les Turpitudes Sociales of 1889 on the left, Pissarro, a lifelong anarchist with socialist leanings, portrayed a Jewish banker with a hooked nose holding on to his money bag for dear life. This image exemplifies age-old anti-Semitic stereotypes and may strike us as incongruent coming from a Jewish person. On the other hand, as Pissarro's first self-portrait of 1873, pictured here on the right, shows, he himself, as can also so often befall Jewish people, grappled with the image of the Jew as a far-seeing and noble sage. Pissarro painted this early self-portrait while living in a small village northwest of Paris. At the age of 43, he is already balding and his full beard is beginning to gray. Pissarro's prematurely white hair and long beard while still a young man earned him the nickname Father Abraham amongst his friends and colleagues. He was the patriarch of the Impressionist movement. As the journalist and trained art historian Adam Gopnik explained in a New Yorker article in December 2023, Pissarro's Jewishness endowed him early with wisdom he did not yet possess. And it seems Pissarro never just got to be human, never just got to be himself. Pissarro painted his own portrait only a few times in his 73 years. For visual reference, I have included here in the upper left a photograph of Pissarro taken in 1890. He made the three self-portraits pictured here in the early 1900s at the very end of his life. Just as we saw in his first self-portrait of 1873 on the last slide, all these images present Pissarro, though much older here on this slide, with stereotypical ethnically Jewish physical attributes. Behold his long gray beard, biblical in its rendering, reminiscent of Moses or Abraham, rabbinical, prophet-like in feel. Late in his life, as the Dreyfus affair raged on, Pissarro's ethnically Jewish appearance collided with daily life in the center of Paris during the worst anti-Semitic street rallies in French history. Confined to his home to escape persecution and real physical danger, he painted the only subjects accessible to him: the view from the window and his own face. Amidst the backdrop of newspaper articles like the following excerpt written by a government official and reprinted in several newspapers, Pissarro could simply no longer ignore just how vulnerable his origins made him. There really are too many Jews in today's society. What gave me some consolation was believing that at least French art, our glory before all foreigners, had escaped their hooked fingernails. Yet it appears I was mistaken. We must urgently, although it may be too late, raise a cry of alarm about the Jewish invasion in fine art, an incomprehensible invasion that cannot be justified on any front, given that Jews are men of money, not of ideals, and that their dominant characteristic is a lack of taste and a love of all things garish, false, and tawdry. And these are the men charged with setting up state exhibitions, with expanding and enriching our museums, of which they are in charge. The image on the far right is the only self-portrait in which Pissarro depicted himself in the act of painting. Here, we see the window he referred to in an earlier quote, and his face, of course. Perhaps it was now, at this very moment, as an old man reflecting on his life, that Pissarro finally realized no amount of minimizing his personal religious beliefs would stop a mob from hurting him just for being Jewish. His wish to assimilate into French society, to blend in and almost camouflage himself or disappear, thereby not calling attention to his Jewish roots and identity, had become impossible. I believe that in this self-portrait, Pissarro consciously presented himself as a Jew. As depressing as this all might seem, one scholar put a positive spin on things when he wrote, "Because the Jew in the heart of the metropole was the stuff of anti-Semitic nightmares, Pissarro triumphed by making the passage of a Caribbean Jew across modern Paris the very subject of his work." Even if one were to take the stance, which I haven't, as you can see, that Pissarro being Jewish should have no bearing on his art, it is unequivocal that there is a great irony in the life our Minette painting has had. It bears witness to one of mankind's darkest chapters. Stepping to the side now of Pissarro's Jewish identity, the hands, countries, and politics Minette has lived through are hard to fathom. It was the very recent exhibition, Afterlives: Recovering the Lost Stories of Looted Art at the Jewish Museum in New York in 2021, that brought this story to light for the public and showed how complicated and sometimes ironic the life of an artwork can be. The show's curators defined afterlives as the notion that art can express both trauma and survival in ways that extend far beyond our own experience. The art objects included in this exhibition were works that have intersected, lived through, or been imprinted by transformative moments from which they acquire a charge. These objects have participated in and been touched by history in ways that are subtly visible, not only in their physical aging, but in the additive signs of where they have been. The entire purpose of the Afterlife show was to activate these latent histories. After Minette was made, Pissarro gave the painting to his dear friend Piet in 1873 to thank him for sheltering Pissarro's family in Brittany during the Franco-Prussian War. In 1874, when Piet heard about Minette's premature death, he returned the painting to Pissarro. Following Pissarro's death in 1903, his widow kept the canvas until 1928, when the Jewish art collector Paul Rosenberg purchased it at a Pissarro sale. By the outbreak of World War II, Minette was in the collection of Bruno Stahl, whose father Heinrich was the chairman of the Jewish community of Berlin during the Nazi regime. Heinrich was deported to the concentration camp Theresienstadt in 1942, but Bruno was able to flee Germany in 1933. Before leaving, he stored his paintings, including this portrait of Minette, in a Paris bank vault, along with works belonging to the prominent Jewish gallerist George Wildenstein. In 1940, a Nazi art looting task force discovered the vault and stole its contents. Although Minette was at one point selected for the personal collection of Nazi senior officer Hermann Göring, it remained for 3 years at the Jeu de Paume Gallery in Paris, which the Nazis had converted into a temporary storage depot. As the Allies entered France and approached Paris, the painting was slated for transport on August 1st, 1944, to a second storage depot in the present-day Czech Republic. However, the train broke down outside Paris, and the painting was recovered just as Paris was liberated. Due to a cataloging error by the Nazis, the portrait was restituted after the war to Wildenstein, who later returned it to Stahl. Ironically, Stahl then sold the painting to Wildenstein in 1949. It was in private hands until 1958, when the Wadsworth purchased it, and where it remains to this day. Imagine this painting, which hangs today in the museum, was once in the hands of Hitler's henchmen and bound for Göring's personal collection. Now that we have discussed Pissarro's Minette in detail, here is the text for the painting's amended label. This will give you an idea of the immense challenge we faced distilling our new findings into a short, digestible format for the public, just 100 words. I will read aloud the text of the new label, which also includes Pissarro's full name at birth, Jacob Abraham Camille Pissarro. Born into a Jewish family on the Caribbean island of St. Thomas, Pissarro later settled in France, where he became a leading Impressionist painter. He chose to downplay his Jewish heritage, partly in response to rising anti-Semitism at the time, as exemplified by the Dreyfus Affair, a scandal involving the wrongful conviction of a French Jewish soldier for treason. By World War II, Pissarro's tender portrait of his daughter Minette was owned by Bruno Stahl in Berlin. Stahl, who was Jewish, stored his art collection in a bank vault as he fled Nazi Germany. The painting was seized by the Nazis, but later recovered by French soldiers and given to the Allied authorities. To conclude, I wish to draw your attention to a very recent story in the news about another Pissarro painting, Girl Lying in the Grass. When acquired by the Kunsthalle Bremen Museum in Germany in 1967, it was not revealed that the painting had belonged to a Dutch Jewish family, the Vandenbergs, before World War II. Jaap Vandenberg bought the painting shortly after the German invasion of the Netherlands in 1940. Then, in 1943, under great duress, he was forced to sell the painting for funds needed for his family to go into hiding from the Nazis. Jaap Vandenberg and his wife Ellen survived the war, but their two young daughters, Rosemarie and Mary Ann, who were hidden separately from their parents, were ultimately betrayed and then killed in Auschwitz. As the New York Times reported in November 2024, the Pissarro is staying in Germany, but the story of the Jewish Vandenberg family is getting out. Indeed, in an unusual Holocaust art restitution case, a Vandenberg heir, a third daughter born to the surviving couple after the war, arranged with the Kunsthalle Bremen that the museum could keep the painting on the condition that it would help publish a book recounting what happened to the Vandenberg family during World War II. Rather than pursuing a protracted legal battle that would have almost certainly resulted in the painting being sold into private hands, the heir opted to instead enlist the museum's help to share the family's Holocaust story with the public. Just as Pissarro's Girl Lying in the Grass has not a care in the world, so too did little Marianne Vandenberg, captured here in a photograph on the right in 1941, playing in the grass and picking flowers. Just as Minette stops us in our tracks with her penetrating gaze, so too did Marianne's older sister, Rosemarie, captured here on a photograph on the left in 1941, before the Holocaust, before life changed for the Jewish people forevermore. Thank you for listening today to the stories of Rosemarie and Mary Ann, to Minette's story, to Pissarro's story. These are stories we need to be telling.
Thank you, Rachel. I just am so engrossed by the story of the Minette picture every time you tell it. And it's really poignant to just think about the life changes and the afterlives of objects, but obviously against the backdrop of what's going on in the country, this is such an important topic. So thank you very much. I am here to monitor the chat. Erica said you can place your questions in the chat. I wanted to just open it up and, I was curious, those self-portraits of Pissarro, I've actually never seen any of them. Are they, you showed about 3. Do you think he sort of became obsessed with his own self-image, or was he just more comfortable later in life?
Yes, I also, Erin, was not familiar with them. There are 4 of them. And I believe, though one would really need to do more research and build a very robust case for it, that this was certainly the 3 of him that I put on the one slide as an older person. imagine him. He was confined to his room in Paris, and he's afraid to go outside. And as he says, it's just, the view from his window, those iconic images we think of his aerial views of Paris, and himself, right?
Yeah.
His face. So that's my theory. And I think there might be something, publishable there, but as I said, one would have to do more research.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a good point, just turning inward and using yourself as a subject. So there's deep appreciation for this poignant history many were unaware of. Someone asks, you read a long paragraph complaining about Jewish people being in charge of art museums. Can you please identify the author?
Sure, that was an example. I don't know the name of the specific author, but that was a newspaper excerpt at the time, toward the end of Pissarro's life. Again, he's living in these confined circumstances, afraid to go outside. And it was just meant to illustrate the kind of venomous feeling that was being promulgated and written about throughout Paris at that time.
Yeah. So a contemporary source at the time. Yeah, that's very indicative. Another question, given Pissarro's parents' estrangement from the Jewish community on St. Thomas, how much exposure to Jewish life and ritual did Pissarro have in his home?
My understanding is that there was observance in his home, but he went to a Moravian school. He did not go to a Jewish school. And
Oh, interesting.
the topic of his familial background and his mother, and it's a very complicated and rich story. There is an Alice Hoffman novel, which many have mentioned along the way, which really focuses on his mother, actually, and on that background. I definitely read about that to some degree, but I was more interested in taking it as a given that there was concrete Jewish exposure, and then what he did with that as an adult person and as an artist, especially, his time in France.
Yeah. Well, certainly the political climate made it more challenging in his lifetime. Any other questions for Rachel, even beyond this particular artist? I mean, there are other artists within the Wadsworth collections that we've been researching. Just more really praise coming in. Bravo, utterly fascinating. Thank you. Let's see. You've opened up a world of knowledge and historical and cultural connections, which it's fascinating to think a painting that has been in our holdings for decades, when the moment comes, when there is this very deep and penetrating perspective. I think not all are as compelling as Minette, but certainly there's really not enough hours in the day to do such a deep dive into every object, but we really do look forward to future objects and future artful conversations with Rachel. I'm gonna just do kind of a last call. Anything else you want to add, Rachel, while we have just a moment?
I guess, Erin, just that I hope that this project continues to see the light of day, that there will be, as you said, more artful conversations, that we're, beginning to talk about possible exhibition. And I think it's so important. So
Yeah.
to share these stories.
Yeah, I agree. Question about one of the articles by Samantha Baskind. Could you repeat that reference?
Sure, that actually, so Samantha Baskind is really the scholar who deserves, I think, all of, if not most of the credit for being the person really pushing the boundaries here. She collaborated with Larry Silver, who also became interested in the topic. And in 2011, they published a book, which I actually have here on my desk for good luck, Jewish Art, A Modern History. And that was the quote about Pissarro that I read was, Even though some Jewish artists are well known, their Jewish dimension remains understudied.
Yeah.
Example, a leading Impressionist painter, Camille Pissarro, from a Sephardic family in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, attempted to shed his Jewish ethnicity while in Paris. Nonetheless, he was still identified by his peers as Jewish in the same era that culminated with anti Semitic cultural strife around the Dreyfus Affair.
Yeah. And that's further encouraged really my and Rachel's kind of taking Samantha Baskind, among others, but her knowledge and her very actively working to reveal the Jewish dimension of so many artists. And right now we have a running list that's pages long of artists in the Wadsworth collections for whom this topic is, not universally applicable. We often think about artists who choose to assimilate and how do you consider them relevant to the topic. But yes, Samantha Baskind's scholarship is quite compelling. Oh, another question. Wondering if the artist is projecting his own isolation upon his solitary daughter. That's interesting.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, we can wonder, but I think it's kind of compelling too. There's a lot to be said for that.
And this point that he was the only Impressionist artist who chose to paint his own family is also, relevant to that point.
Right. Yeah, we're not out at the Moulin Rouge or anything. All right. Well, I think that I've covered all of the questions. Many docents, current and former, are very appreciative of this information as well. So I think we'll wrap it up. There's information in the chat if you are interested in membership to the Wadsworth Athenaeum or specifically supporting this project. We are honestly, in many ways, crowdsourcing support. So we will leave you that information in the chat. Oh, quick question. Didn't Renoir also paint his son?
So I was thinking about that too. I'm not a student directly of Impressionist art, but I do think it's funny that you point that out because I did recall that Renoir also, there's a famous painting too at the Metropolitan Museum in New York of two young girls at a piano. And that also merits further research, but it was Pissarro who really focused on this, and just Minette alone, the sheer number of paintings of her. So I think
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
point.
And of course, I think of Mary Cassatt, who's not exactly the same trajectory, and obviously many familial portraits, although she did not have children of her own. But also as a female practitioner, there's reasons why that may have come to be her subject as well. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rachel. And we will keep everybody posted about the next Artful Conversation. We try to do these sort of seasonally, at least Rachel's particular project. So thank you so much for your support, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.